Don't step on that butterfly. Do you remember this episode of The Simpsons when Homer turns his toaster into a time machine and travels back to the time of the dinosaurs?
This is gonna cost me.
If you watched or read any time travel story in which the protagonists travel to the past, you'll probably have heard the warning about not changing anything, nothing at all. Of course, we're all familiar with the grandfather paradox. If you travel back in time and kill your grandfather before he can father your father, then you will never have been born. So you couldn't have travelled back and killed your grandfather, so you do exist, therefore, and so on and so on. But the warning is more general than that. If you travel back to the Cretaceous and step on a butterfly, or sneeze, who knows what unforeseen impact that might have on future events. It's kind of like the butterfly effect, but through time rather than across space. The effects of some small, insignificant event can be amplified by the laws of chaos and have massive, unforeseen consequences. So, if we were to travel back in time, we'd be too scared to move, like Homer. But even standing still, we might get in the way of something else that is moving. At the very least, we change the thermodynamics and entropy of the past system just by being there. We're terrified of the possible consequences of our actions. We perhaps think this way about the past, but what about the present? Don't our actions here in the present have a similar potential impact on the future? How do I know whether killing that cockroach won't result in the total destruction of the human race? But we don't actually think that way. If we did, we'd never do anything. We'd never venture outside. We'd be totally paralysed. But this too might have unforeseen consequences. But we don't think like that. By and large, we tend to think that our daily actions and decisions, our minute-by-minute actions and decisions, are not very consequential. Just occasionally, we might find ourselves at some kind of pivotal point in our own life, or even a pivotal point in society at large, when we realise that our decisions and actions are going to be very consequential. And there are perhaps moments in history, pivotal points, kind of nexus, where if a different decision had been made, there might have followed a vastly different future. What if, for instance, Lee Harvey Oswald had decided at the last minute not to pull the trigger, and Kennedy had lived to serve 2 terms as president? What might the world be like today? Well, we don't know, but we can imagine that it would indeed be different. There are indeed points in human history that seem more significant than others. And if we were to find ourselves at such a juncture, we might indeed find ourselves paralysed by indecision. But, by and large, we will kill that cockroach without a second thought. Obviously, we can't permit ourselves to become paralysed by the fear of possible unforeseen consequences. Actually, though, I think our fear of changing past events is probably exaggerated, unless it is indeed something that affects one of those pivotal moments in history. If we were to decide, for instance, to go back in time and stop Lee Harvey Oswald, or go back in time and assassinate Hitler. Stepping on a butterfly in the Cretaceous period, though, we probably shouldn't worry too much about that. Why not? Well, partly because of chaos theory itself, I think. When we think of the effect we might have on future events by stepping on a butterfly in the past, we tend to think in terms of ripples, that somehow we've set a ripple in motion that may become amplified through time. But that's not actually how ripples work, is it? Think about dropping a pebble in the centre of a still lake. The ripples move outward from the point of impact, but they don't grow, they diminish. And I would suggest that this is, in fact, because the random, chaotic movement of the water molecules smothers the ripples. The effects of our ripple are soon swallowed up by this chaotic motion until the effect is, in fact, negligible. Now imagine dropping that pebble into choppy water. The effects vanish almost immediately if they have any visible effect at all. I would suggest that stepping on a butterfly in the Cretaceous is more like tossing a pebble into an oncoming tsunami. It will be completely swallowed up and have no long-term and practically no short-term effect at all. If we broaden the time scale, this is probably true even of those events in human history which we regard as pivotal or particularly consequential. I would postulate that even changing an event such as the assassination of Kennedy would ultimately have limited effect, even on human society and history. It will slowly be subsumed by the chaos of history. Of course, it would have short-term effects, but 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, it may be swallowed by the tsunami of history. Of course, I know I can't prove that, even in principle. But I can take it one step further. Let's broaden the scale beyond merely human space and time. On the scale of the solar system, on the scale of the galaxy. Clearly, even what we consider a major event will ultimately be swallowed up by the chaos if we increase the scale far enough. I think there's a kind of comfort in knowing that our actions, even on just the human scale, will ultimately be swallowed up by the chaos of the socio-historical process. Of course, they have local impact, and I'm not suggesting that we just do anything we want to because ultimately nothing matters. Things matter at different scales. But what I'm suggesting is that when we come to those pivotal moments in our lives, the moments when we might find ourselves paralyzed by indecision, remember two things. First, that you will never be able to know beforehand all the consequences of any decision you make. The truth is that any action you take will have both desirable and undesirable consequences. Stepping on that cockroach may have positive consequences for your health and hygiene, but the consequences may not be quite so positive for the cockroach. If you try to anticipate all the possible consequences of any decision you make, you'll suffer from decision paralysis. But secondly, know also that any ripples you make will ultimately be absorbed into the chaos of history and the universe. The tsunami will proceed unchecked.